But first, let's talk a little bit more about the methodology here, and maybe just sort of your view on how well we're doing right now about tracking murder and gun and just crime generally, given sort of the FBI's switch over in methodology for how they're collecting data. We talked about this on a previous podcast that I encourage people to listen to. But first, let's talk about your specific model. You gave us a little bit of insight into it earlier, and then I want to talk about what's going on with the FBI. But so you have 104 cities, basically police departments that you're taking data from. How does that process work? Because they're not sending it to you. It's not like the FBI where the FBI is requesting data from every police agency basically in the country and they send it in. It's voluntary, but it has historically had a pretty high rate of compliance. How does your organization actually go through and collect this data?
We do it the hard way. We go through manually, and once a week we click on. If you go to our website ahdatalytics.com, you can go to the year-to-date murder dashboard. There's a link that sends you to every source, and so probably 99 or 100 of the 104 agencies are coming from the agency themselves or from the major chiefs of police, where they put out a report every quarter. So we've got about 15 agencies that we're using their data. But
so it's official. It's official data from the police departments.
Yeah, it's just flow. So we only have data through the first quarter for those agencies. The issue with our methodology is that we have some cities that produce data daily. We have Washington, D.C., Kansas City, New Orleans, St. Louis. They produce daily data on their murder numbers. Other cities do it weekly. Philadelphia puts out a great report every week. Chicago, New York does the same thing. Some agencies do it monthly, and they report the data reasonably quickly within the first 2 or 3 weeks of the next month. Some agencies do it quarterly. Some agencies do it monthly, but San Bernardino, California is a good one. They've only got data through February. They do it monthly, but they haven't published any data since February. Newark is another one, has not published since April. So it's very frustrating to see a lot of these agencies that there's no standard practice for how often to publish. There's no standard practice for how to publish. DC, you click the button, it goes to the website. They show you the number of murders this year. They show you the number of murders last year. Other places you get a PDF. Some places like Memphis, because Memphis is such an important city because of what's happening there to have in our sample, we have to download their homicide data from, they provide it on an incident basis. So we download the data and compare how many incidents this year versus how many incidents last year. So it can be a little bit challenging with some agencies. It makes for some places that we've got a lot of confidence in, and some places where I really wish that I had data that was more up to date, and we just don't. And that's the best system. If there was a better system, we would use it. If we could scrape the data from every agency, we would do that. But agencies frequently aren't using the same addresses. They aren't using the same methodology. I'm not the most technical person in the world. I'm not sure how to scrape a PDF that's published monthly on a different, with a different web address each month. So it can be very challenging, and the only solution is just sort of brute force it every month or every week.
Yeah, so it's a very time intensive process, it sounds like, and but it is coming from official sources, which is a little bit different, I guess, to the other one of the other measures that's out there. It's not the FBI. Before we get to them, there's Gun Violence Archive, which you did talk about in your piece, and we've interviewed the head of Gun Violence Archive before. You know, they're most famous for their mass shooting counter that gets a lot of attention in media, but they track all kinds of different incidents, or they try to, but they basically their methodology is to use reports, like public like from the media, to track things, right? That's one distinction between the two of you.
Yeah, and they're doing everywhere, and they're doing an aggregated count. I think that they are a wonderful source of information. We know exactly how many people were shot in Philadelphia this year because Philadelphia's police department has put that data out there. So we can compare their data to gun violence archive how many people they say have been shot in Philadelphia, and we will see a difference. And so their methodology I find to be inaccurate or imprecise, but generally accurate. Right. So if you compare their trend with Philadelphia's trend, the numbers won't be the same, but the trends will be the same. Right. And so I find them to be a good sort of additional means of showing that our sample is not crazy, that this is actually what's happening nationwide.
Yeah, I think the main critique for them, and again, we have a whole podcast where we get into these discussions with the founder of GVA, but is more about their definitions of things like mass shootings rather than their actual data that they've collected. But you also said in your piece that their numbers give further credence to your analysis for this mid-year estimate on I keep adding gun in there, just murder rates for where the murder rate is. The gun murder rate is a slightly different statistic than the murder rate, not something that you guys have tracked, right? But
no, and we sort of assume that non-gun murders are kind of stable. They've been generally stable for the last years, decades in the U.S., and it's really been changes in shootings that has been what's driven the U.S. murder rate. So, sure. You can compare their data and their collection to the national trend and see the same thing. It's not as reliable, I think, we know that gun, that the big city sample overstates the national trend. I know that. I can show that year after year for the last 2.5 decades. With the gun violence archive, it's sort of up or down from the national trend. It's usually within about 3% as well, but there's no predictable way of knowing whether or not it's up or down from the national trend. And so, and then some years it's been very close. Some years it's been off by 5 or 6%. So it's hard to say, other than that both of these metrics are pointing in the same direction, which hopefully gives some confidence that direction is accurate.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing there. I mean, certainly the Gun Violence Archive, one critique of their methodology is just that they're relying on media reports, which are not going to cover everything. This is sort of much more relevant to things like defensive gun use than it is to murder, because murder is much more likely to get covered in local media than a defensive gun use situation where no shots are fired or maybe the police aren't even informed of it. But that's obviously a completely separate situation, which we had with the head of Gun Violence Archive and people can listen to. But the important bit is that you've got these two substantially different methodologies, but they're both showing the same thing, which is a decline in murder through the first 6 months of 2023. Now, you mentioned earlier the FBI, and we'll get maybe a more complete picture of what's going on once their numbers come out. But of course, that won't be for a year and a half, I guess, or maybe a little bit less than a year and a half. Like, we don't have 2022 numbers from the FBI yet, right? So we're gonna have to wait a while before we see the FBI's numbers. But I do want to talk and get your view on their methodology issues, because somewhat unfortunately, the FBI has decided to switch to a new system for reporting crime data right as the murder spike was happening, right? They changed how they're bringing in numbers from police departments. And unfortunately, when you do that, even if the new system is better, when this is a voluntary program, you're going to have a lot of police departments a lot of government institutions that just aren't going to follow over, at least not right away. And that's basically what we've seen, right? They've lost a lot of departments reporting to them, correct?
So they did in 2021. Only about 65% of the U.S. population was covered by an agency that reported to NIBRS, and only about 52% of the U.S. population was covered by an agency that reported 12 months of data to NIBRS. Like, right. Chicago Police Department reported only 7 months of data to NIBRS because they weren't NIBRS compliant for the first 5 months of the year.
And that's the new system. That's the acronym.
Right. There is good news, though, and I don't know why the FBI hasn't been talking about this publicly, but they are going to, in 2022, allow agencies to report the old way as well. So it used to be back in 2019, 2020, it was kind of an even split, maybe 55-45, as far as agencies reporting via NIBRs and agencies reporting via the summary reporting system, which is the system that's been in use for 90 something years. So for 2022, they're going to allow agencies that did not make the transition to NIBRs to submit their crime data so that it can be included in the estimates. So in theory, this should make the estimates much stronger for 2022 and beyond. And again, it's something that we don't know exactly how much of an impact this is going to have. It's something that I've been told several times by the FBI, but they haven't talked about sort of this implementation. So is it plausible that agencies will report 2022 data and will do it at the same level? Yeah. Is it possible that some agencies that just didn't make the NIBRs transition and have just decided not to report data at all, even though they can? It's also possible for that. So it's hard to say exactly what that number would be, but in theory, the estimates for 2022 and beyond will be much stronger than they were in 2021, which it'll be an asterisk forever.
Yeah, because they lost like 5,000 police departments, if you look at least what they're saying on their website for their estimates in 2021. So does that mean they're just going to have like one bad year? 2021 is just going to be a year where they had really bad numbers, and then it goes back to having 80+% compliant, 80+% of the country covered by these reports.
It looks that way. And it used to be 95 to 97% of agencies would report under the old system. So
fascinating.
It does look like there's going to be a much better report in 2022 , but don't hold me to that. Don't call me back on here.
I'll hold the FBI to that. It'll be their responsibility. Don't worry.